see that. Oh, well, she got one of those flus, yeah.
Francine was down all on Christmas.
Yeah, it's been, there's still just a slight residual.
These girls, I went to a party, couple parties.
This is really the killer flu and the ironic.
Grandmother was sick.
Really? Well, it's deadly. People are dying from it.
Oh, I know.
I don't know how I was getting it.
1917 bug. 1917, people got sick in the morning.
Well, you know, that's funny. I was telling the story about when the bubonic plague came across Europe and wiped out half of us.
Yeah.
That's all amazing.
It's almost 25% of the flu thing
No kidding.
across the world. Because World War I. That's right.
I like how that was about them up there.
Anyway, so
So why are you here? Which particular interest?
we have the retail energy supply.
Yeah.
Have you been watching?
I've been watching some of it. I mean, we're keeping track of it, but
We've never mentioned
Lady
it.
Carol Turner, Jesse, and I, she's pretty much watching every single thing. Jesse and I sort of drift in and drift out as the issues are particularly.
I've been to almost all of them. Our guy is in Carson today. I don't know if you saw him, Ned Ross.
Yeah, we read some of your, not yours, or some of your comments, yeah. It's
Right. Are you sure there's the meeting next week?
you don't like it?
On the 23rd? Yeah, it says canceled.
Percival and not Pete. I mean, he admits to ignoring it.
Well,
He cannot answer a yes or no question in less than 5 minutes.
I
I
think
mean, not so much in this, but in those, some of those task force meetings, it's just.
part of it, I mean, you know, unless the commissioner, whoever it may be, has had really extensive experience, there's some pretty arcane shit that goes on here.
It's a complicated issue. It's hard to get your head around it.
Good morning. This is the time and place set for day 3 of the investigatory workshop into the Energy Choice Initiative in docket 17-10001. My name is Joe Reynolds and I'm the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada here in Carson City. We also have video link this morning to our offices in Las Vegas. Today's issue that we'll be talking about and looking into is options reasonably available to Nevada in designing and establishing a competitive retail electric service market, including but not limited to relative pros and cons, the best practices in structure for Nevada, and options for a service provider of last resort. The format today will be the same as the previous 2 workshops that have been held so far this week. And as I stated yesterday, I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning and all the participants in this matter. It's, I believe, very important to the state of Nevada and for us to be able to hit the ground running should this ballot petition be passed by the voters again this coming November. I'd like to start today's workshop was similar to the question I started yesterday's workshop, is what is a retail market? And what's the difference between a retail market and a wholesale market? And while this is a very basic question, I think it needs to be the first one to inform the rest of the conversations today. Is there anyone that wants to give a stab at that, to put that on the record? You both can come up. It would be great. Good morning, Mr. Ross, and thank you for coming up this morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Ned Ross for RESA, the Retail Energy Supply Association. I had a hunch you were staring at me back there.
I was loosely staring at everybody.
Okay.
And thank you, Ms. Anne Marie Cuneo, Director of our Regulatory Operations Staff. Thank you for coming up as well.
I think the simple answer, and you're probably tired of hearing it on day 3, is that that's up to your legislature to decide. But generally speaking, the wholesale market is the purchase of bulk power or the sale of bulk power, as opposed to the sale of retail power to an establishment at the final meter. So if you're buying power for resale, it would be a wholesale transaction generally. Maybe we look to John Wellinghoff for more refined definitions, but generally if you're buying power for resale, it's more of a wholesale type transaction. If you're selling it to an end user, that is a retail transaction regardless of the size of the end user.
Is it in, I guess what again, we're just making a record. So
Sure.
Is the retail provider, are they, for lack of a better word, the middleman? You know, we have the raw purchase, producers who generate the electricity, and then we have the end use customers, whether the homeowner, the business that actually turns the light switch. Is the retail provider someone in the middle of that transaction?
That's correct. It's a middleman type transaction. You could also think of it as the refiner. You take the rough crude out of the ground, you got to take it to the refinery to make the products, and the products are sold to market. So the other thing that the retailer does is it takes basic bulk power and then spreads it out over time elements and usage elements and makes it more useful for the end user. That's the role of the provider.
So it's there's a distinction there between the wholesale market and the retail market.
Yes.
Ms. Cuneo, can you expand on that?
I think that was a very fair description. Essentially, the wholesale market is sales for resale, and the retail market is for those that are, Anne Marie Cuneo, for those who wish to flip the light switch. It's the sale to the ultimate customer who's going to use the power for their daily living or business.
And where I kind of wanted to take this is the general public does not routinely deal with a wholesale provider in the wholesale market, but it's the retail market that we become more aware of. Right now in Nevada, because we have a monopoly structure, that we have one retail provider, which is NV Energy, in its 2 component parts of Nevada Power Company and Sierra Pacific Power Company. My understanding of what the petition looks to achieve is we expand that list of different retail providers that will be participants in a retail marketplace, and we're opening that up. So there's a lot more folks and a lot more logos, companies that Nevadans can be aware of and choose from, other than Nevada Power Company and Sierra Pacific Power Company.
Correct. There's an example I would use possibly is a wholesaler that has the whole chain down would be sort of like going to the winery to buy your favorite bottle of wine. They produce it there, they grow it there, they produce it there, they make it there, you drink it there, you buy it there. Now you would be growing it there, producing it there, but shipping it through a retailer or a reseller, Total Wine and Spirits, so to speak, and then going to the retail store to buy your wine instead of doing it at the winery.
Thank you for that. Mr. John Wellinghoff, good morning, and thank you for being here today.
Good morning, Chairman Reynolds. John Wellinghoff on behalf of ECI. Apologize for not being here the previous 2 days, although I've had some good people taking notes, so I have an idea of what you've done over the last 2 days, and you really have covered a lot, and it's really great. The retail markets and the wholesale markets are a little bit more complex in the sense that, and it wasn't really mentioned yesterday, and so I wanted to get this in, and I think it's probably appropriate in this discussion here. If we go to retail choice and also participate in a wholesale market such as CAISO, Nevadans for the first time will have the opportunity as retail behind-the-meter end-use customers to actually participate in a wholesale market, i.e. they will actually be able to sell products into that market under FERC Order 755, which relates to regulation service, under Order 745, which relates to energy service. Retail customers have the ability, as we know, to have generation on site, have the ability to do demand response, have the ability to have storage on site, have the ability to have a whole array of products and services that not only they can use internally to reduce their own energy costs, like people who do so with net metering in Nevada, but also to utilize those products to actually sell up into the wholesale market. And they can do that individually, or they can do that in aggregation through aggregators, third-party aggregators can come in. They're doing that now in California, and there's something called a DRAM, which they're selling demand response into the markets, and there are other entities who actually are selling energy into the markets from retail customers. So it gets a little bit more complex, but that complexity provides for the opportunity to reduce costs, to reduce your bills that you don't have now. You don't have that opportunity because Nevada Power is the only provider that you can interface with. You can't interface with a wholesale market beyond that.
No, Dan, thank you for that, and I'd even ask you if you can expand on that some more, because something that we did discuss yesterday that we're looking at is the ability to export energy, and or does that relate to the idea of exporting? If we have, for example, rooftop solar customers, either individually or can collectively form an association with their neighbors, and excess energy that they produce, are you saying that they can somehow transfer that and sell that?
Yes. Ultimately, again, if you're part of the footprint, part of the control area of the CAISO, that once you're in that control area, you can participate in any market products that they have available in their market. So if they have energy, they don't have capacity yet. Right now they have a resource adequacy construct and not a capacity market, but they do have an ancillary services market. So energy and ancillary services are products that are listed within the CAISO market tariffs, and consumers in Nevada, if they're part of that CAISO, can ultimately participate in that and bid those products into those markets.
And this may be a naive question, but it's one I've thought about, so I'm just gonna ask it. Is it absolutely necessary to have a wholesale market before you create a retail market? Because I noticed that in the petition it says create a retail market, and I don't believe it mentions the word wholesale in the constitutional amendment language. Are they always necessary to be done like that?
Ned Ross, I think it is essential because we have to be able to access the products we need to resell. So I don't know who would sell the power to my company to make a sale to an end user in a retail sale if we don't have a wholesale market from which to purchase. So what Mr. Willinghoff is describing is precisely right. The companies that own the generation, that own the solar, will offer that power into a market for sale 24 hours a day if it's available, if the plants are up and running. And those various products are sliced up into the time periods they're offering it, how much, what kinds of service, whether it's regulation, ancillary services, other kinds of things. It's all sliced up. That's what drives the efficiency, is they then find the best use for that power product. We then go out and have to manage the loads that our customers have, the demands that they have. We have to manage that and balance our purchases with our sales. That falls on us. That doesn't fall on the customer.
Thank you. When we're going to be looking at creating a retail market, what would be your advice, Mr. Ross, on where do we begin? Where does the legislature begin?
I think the simplest path for creating a retail market is to look at statutory construct that already sits in other states and pick and choose the best of it. And I would lift generally the statutes that you like, lift it out, and just conform it to what you want it to be. The two models that we're most familiar with and most pleased with are the Pennsylvania and Texas models, and those statutory constructs are very well defined. They provide the commission liberal authority to operate and manage day to day, particularly in a jurisdiction where you have biennial legislative sessions. You don't have 2 years to wait sometimes in an electric market. You have to act. And so those statutes allow the commissions to move within the space of the statutory language and conform the market to meet the needs of the folks and keep the lights on. So that language exists, and we can have folks walk you through it and see which you prefer. But I would hesitate to recreate fresh language from scratch. I think that would be very difficult because there have been now 15 to 20 years of experience with that language.
Any further thoughts on that, Ms. Cunha?
Well, I think what he said about taking the experience of others and being aware of that is very valuable. So that's about it.
The one thing, I agree, we don't need to recreate the wheel. We can take pieces of it. As you and I have discussed, because Texas is also very unique in its own world into itself in terms of the energy.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Oh,
You're talking about energy, okay.
It's not meant to be not a compliment. Is how comparable is it to look to Texas fully to Nevada's needs? I mean, we're so different than Texas in so many ways in terms of where we are with our resources and our geography and our economy and things of that sort.
I would characterize it this way: we're quite different, but we're quite similar as well. We both have biennial legislative sessions. We both have similar structures at the legislative level and senior leadership. We both have commissions that operate in this manner that undertake telecom and energy and all these other key ingredients for the state. So in that respect, we're very similar. The only thing that makes Texas the least bit unique in energy is that it is an electrical island in the ERCOT territory. And so that market is controlled by the commission. But in this case, on a retail level, not a wholesale level, but at a retail level, you're going to operate within the confines of the state. You're not looking to FERC for guidance for retail transactions. So in that respect, you're exactly the same as Texas, exactly the same as Pennsylvania and Ohio and all the other states that have gone down this path. So I think you could look to that language for guidance. And I think that what makes Texas unique, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman,
No, go
what
ahead.
makes Texas unique in terms of the electric structure is that we bill customers. The retail providers have a relationship with the customer, and we bill them. And in other states, we don't. The utility continues to bill the customer. And it's a tremendous advantage to build brand, to build recognition, to sell products, to be able to bill the customer. That's a big differentiation, and that's all in the statutory language and in the substantive rules.
Can you explain it, meaning bill, who billing the customer? I mean,
Yes, sir.
Isn't the retail provider always the person that bills the customer?
In the other states, the utilities bill the customer. They take the retail component, add it to their bill, and they still get the bill from the utility. But in Texas, from the very beginning, they said, we want the retail provider to have the relationship with the customer. We want the phone calls and the inquiries to go to the retail provider, and that's how the market is structured. And that's allowed for this incredible wave of new products and services that are being offered. That bill is really important.
Because in my mind, I just presumed that would always be the case, because it seems would make sense to me. because that is where the customer relationship
Yes, sir, I
is
agree with you.
in the branding that goes along with that. What would be the rationale for not doing it that way?
I don't know.
I can answer that.
Ms. Cuneo?
Anne-Marie Cuneo, the rationale for doing it that way is data management, personal information management. Sometimes, the customers don't want their data going from company A to company B to company C, the personal information, the usage information. There's privacy concerns sometimes around, depending on what your rules are, you can alleviate all of these concerns. But there are customers that have privacy concerns that was the result of many states allowing the electric utility to continue to perform the billing function. So privacy, meter data management issues.
I can ask you, Mr. Ross, what did Texas do to get this? You're saying that in Texas there's a legislature that meets once every 2 years, like in our state, and so there's a lot to get done in a very short amount of time. What did Texas put in place to get the ball rolling on this? Was there? Because this is very complex, and there is a lot of expertise that's necessary to really do it right. Was there a working group established? Was there a particular lead entity that was put in charge of it? How did Texas start this?
It took several years and a lot of pushing from different factions, and I think the leading entities that were kind of driving a move toward competition were the manufacturers, the big consumers, the transmission level consumers on the electric grid. They were very eager to get competitive solutions to meet their needs. They needed the ability to hedge the cost of electricity because they consumed so much of it that they were trying to compete globally with a flat rate utility rate, and it wasn't working. So that was one of the big drivers, and the manufacturing base in Texas is very large. And so, so they were able to push the concept. Then when it began to roll out, you had all the different stakeholders involved in the state, the oil and gas community, the manufacturers, the retail establishments, what we think of as big box stores. All of them gathered up and had trade associations or individuals who represented them in this process. When it came time to actually pass language, the Senate and House leadership called them in a room very much like this and had each of those factions represented, a consumer advocate, PUC staff. Everybody had a voice in the room, and they sat down for weeks and hammered out and negotiated on how this market will work. And as it was described by the Senate and House leaders who undertook these discussions, everyone had to give something up, and everyone had to gain something. And in the course of that stakeholder process, they came up with what I believe is the best electric market in the world. It's commonly thought that it is the best electric market in the world. It's very efficient, it's very cost effective, and because you have the experts in the room, you have the parties in the room who have the skin in the game, the parties who are expending their money and their resources to function in this environment. You have those people with the most at stake. You came up with the best solutions, and you can do the same thing here. You just need to get the people in the room, and I think you'd be surprised how much commonality they would have in forming the correct market.
And you don't have a lot of federal government oversight of it.
No, sir, we don't miss it.
That's what we were talking about.
So that's
yesterday.
Mr. Wellinghoff. Go ahead.
How does Texas, while we're talking about Texas and looking at it as a model, how does Texas deal with resource planning issues, the RPS or the RPS, renewable portfolio standard issues in the state?
So the statutory language, and I mentioned this room full of folks, there were environmentalists and others in the room that had a seat at the table, and one of their drop-dead requirements was we have to have a renewable standard. We want to know that the state is going to move forward with renewable energy, and so the initial 1999 statutory language had a renewable portfolio standard. It was fairly modest in the scale of the Texas business. It was 2,000 megawatts that they had put in the original language. But it was a jump start, and that's what it was intended to do, was jump start the renewable business there. We have tremendous wind resources in Texas, and it got off to a bit of a slow start. In 2005, the wind business began to evolve. So 6 years later, the price of wind came down, the turbines became more technologically advanced, and it just exploded on the scene. And we were building thousands of megawatts a year. We now have 20,000 megawatts of wind on the ground in Texas. And virtually all of it is built on private balance sheets at no expense to what used to be the ratepayer, now the customer. It's all built at risk on private balance sheets. So that's how the renewable standard was jump-started. 2000 and 2005 had to make some modifications to the statute, and the reason the wind exploded is that this modification to the statute ensured that transmission lines would be built to accommodate the wind. So we expanded the standard from 2,000 to 5,000. And when wind developers knew that the transmission lines would come if they built their farms, they then went out confidently and leased up land, built the farms, and the transmission lines were built in what is now known as the CREZ docket, Competitive Renewable Energy Zone docket. So that's how that all evolved, but that was just one component that had to be in there. We had other components that they insisted on. The consumer advocates wanted to ensure we had low income benefits. They wanted to ensure we had coverage for critical care customers, for those who rely on electricity for their life support.
So if you were advising our Nevada State Legislature to have one bill draft at the beginning of next legislative session when it starts, what would that be to get this started in terms of creating a retail market?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
What do you think the first piece of legislation the Nevada State Legislature should enact if this initiative petition passes for us to start in the 2019 legislative session? What should be legislative priority number one in terms of establishing a retail market?
I think in Reese's comments you would see that we support the Texas statutory construct, PURA, the Public Utility Regulatory Act. It's a comprehensive statute that gives you all the guidance you need, and if you lift from that all those components that you want to implement here, I think you'd have tremendous guidance with that.
So you don't have any even just specific, do you think it should designate an expert, a lead entity, any kind of further investigation or study? I guess that's what I'm looking at. Should there be a piece of paper with, BDR, bill draft request number, 1001 or something, and legislature hereby does X, Y, and Z to begin the implementation of ballot initiative 3.
I'm not as sure about the process here in terms of how that works. The way it would work in Texas is that we would get experienced legal counsel to draft the statutory language and hand it off to a legislator for consideration. So I think the process here is a bit different in terms of how that legislation is drafted. But again, I'll reiterate what I said I think a couple days ago, and that is you need an in-house expert here in the commission to help guide that process, because they're going to look to you for that guidance. The legislators are part-time like they are in Texas. It's the same situation. They're bankers and lawyers and ranchers. They're not energy folks, and they're going to look to you for all that guidance, and they're going to expect you to have that. So somehow, we hope you can find a way to get somebody in that can walk you through the benefits and drawbacks of every one of those provisions.
No, thank you.
Yes,
I would note on that comment, some of them over there are energy experts. We do have some legislators that know this issue as well as anybody anywhere, I think. But your point is well taken.
That's
a lot
great.
of them.
That's very helpful, actually. Yeah.
Ms. Barbash from NV Energy, good morning. Thank you for coming up.
Good morning, Chairman Reynolds. I just wanted to address a couple of your questions. I tried to write some of them down, but the first one, and this is obvious, is wholesale markets, about the difference between wholesale and retail markets. Wholesale markets are under federal jurisdiction, and retail markets are the jurisdiction of the state, as long as the state's rules around the retail markets don't interfere with interstate commerce or the wholesale market pricing constructs. Regarding the differences between Texas, just a few that come to my mind between Texas and Nevada. One, before the retail market was opened, the ERCOT wholesale market was in place, albeit they did not yet have a nodal market in place yet, and they later invested in that wholesale market, I think, or the nodal market, which I think was around $500 to $600 million.
And for those who may be listening who might not readily know what the ERCOT market is, can you explain?
Yeah, that's a locational marginal pricing where the prices, a nodal market would be, the ERCOT market?
Yes.
It's the wholesale market that serves the competitive retail portions of Texas. Not necessarily the rules and public power agencies who opted out of retail choice in the Texas model. But that's the ERCOT model, and they are not federally regulated because of the lack of interstate commerce in Texas due to the lack of interchange between other states. So that's one difference, I think. And then Texas has a very different resource mix. As Mr. Ross mentioned, he's very knowledgeable about the Texas market. As he mentioned, there's a lot of wind resources there versus Nevada's solar and geothermal is typically the source of Nevada's renewables. Texas did not open its retail market via a constitutional amendment, which does afford the Public Utilities Commission of Texas to have a lot more leeway to change things as necessary, as they come up with issues in the market. You asked a question about resource planning and resource adequacy. Texas does not have a planning reserve margin requirement. There is a guideline, and ERCOT relies on a scarcity pricing in order to incent new build. $9,000 price spikes, which I believe Mr. Ross explained on the first day of our meetings here. Texas did not have a lot of smart meters in place when it opened its retail market. I believe they still don't have a majority of smart meters installed with their customers. Oh, they have? Okay.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And then there's very little rooftop solar in Texas and net metering customers. Texas PUC does not require net metering of retail competitors or the regulated utilities.
And that was something too that I understand in Texas. There's some pockets of some certain urban areas that are fully regulated, in that those places that do still have a net metering structure aren't in a competitive marketplace, and that there's enclaves where those are very different than the rest of the state. And I would imagine to preserve the ability of the net metering paradigm to remain unaffected by the other deregulation.
That's correct. Ned Ross for RESA. The Texas market is best described as a patchwork quilt, realizing that ERCOT doesn't even cover the entire state. If you kind of picture Texas, the Panhandle is not in ERCOT. El Paso on the far west corner of Texas is not in ERCOT, and there are portions of far east Texas that are not in ERCOT. So the purely Texas market that is ERCOT doesn't even cover the whole state, but that's the only competitive portion of the state. And then within ERCOT, there are municipal utilities and cooperative utilities that are not required to opt into competition. They are allowed to opt in if they wish to, but they're not required to. Right now, the city of Lubbock, up toward the Panhandle, is leaving SPP because that city is on the border between SPP and ERCOT. They're opting into ERCOT because they like the ERCOT market better. They think it's going to better suit them, and they're thinking of opting into competition. So it'll be the first big municipal utility to opt into competition.
And that's something that when we were discussing some of this in both the two previous day workshops is, the fact that Texas did leave some of those areas fully regulated, I think, to protect affect some of the net energy NEM customers, in that this ballot petition, I don't think gives the authority to be able to do that here in Nevada. And so I would imagine we need to think through that to make sure that no harm comes to that NEM paradigm that we have in Nevada, because the fact again that Texas carved that out tells me that that was a concern there.
If I may,
Sure.
In 1999, when they had the roundtable discussion, the municipalities and cooperatives were represented at the table, and they did not want to enter the market. So they simply didn't enter because politically they did not want to, and they could not be forced to. So that was one of the compromises that was struck in the original language of Senate Bill 20. Senate Bill 7. So that was simply a political compromise. Looking back now at that decision, there's clear evidence, and there was a study we reference in our comments that Rice University did on who is benefiting from competition and who is benefiting from municipal power or monopoly power. And that study clearly indicates that competition is working. It is not a price comparison study, because it's impossible to do a price comparison study. What it does show is the correlation between the underlying cost of energy, the wholesale price of energy, and the price in the competitive market and the price in the monopoly markets that continue to exist. And they did it each year over the last 15 years. And the trend is very clear that competition is working, because the competition line tracks with the underlying cost of energy and actually converges, which indicates that retailers like my company and others are getting better at what we do. We're getting more competitive. We're sharpening our pencils. So
The purpose of my question, or asking these questions, isn't even to debate about the competition. It's that there is a concern, and Texas dealt with that concern, one way, and I don't think it's a way that Nevada can deal with that concern. So given what we're looking at with this constitutional amendment, how do we think of new ways to make sure that them customers aren't negatively impacted by this, and what can we do different, because that Texas remedy isn't available to us, I think, under this constitutional amendment.
I would characterize, and very sincerely characterize, this as an opportunity. You have an opportunity to open this statute for consideration in all kinds of ways. Normally, industry doesn't look at an opportunity to open statute because there's a lot of risk when a legislature gets a hold of a statute and starts to move it around. This is an opportunity for all the parties to come to a table and say, let's fix this, let's make this better. If you choose, and I do want to differentiate my comments with Carolyn's. Carolyn mentioned that this is a constitutional amendment. The ballot initiative is. The legislation is not. The legislation will just be the statutory construct that forms your market. So what I'm suggesting is that this is a chance for you to get that right. If you want NEM, if you want other benefits, if you want to ramp up your renewable portfolio, this is your opportunity to do it. This is a chance for folks to sit around and discuss what are the impacts of that, who pays for it.
And I think it was Ms. Barbash's comments were, because we're doing this new in the state with a constitutional amendment, as I've said before, any NRS provisions are subservient to the constitutional provisions.
Right.
And so in that regard, we have less leeway if this constitutional amendment passes than Texas does, because the legislature can come in and change the law. Governor can call a special session and get the legislature in and change something if it's some language isn't correct or it's not working the way it was envisioned. I think in my mind, Nevadans passed a gun background check measure, changed the Constitution, and now we've learned that language does not work, at least in some view, the way that the proponents intended it, and so it's not being put into effect. We don't, and there's no way to necessarily change that through a legislative session, because it's in the Constitution. And so the permanence of that, I think, puts that's a different concern. But I want to get back to Ms. Barbash, because you were in the middle of your comments and kind of got diverted a little bit. So
Finally, I'll just point out one other obvious difference between Texas and Nevada is that Texas has about 10 times the electric usage as Nevada, and that may be obvious, but the important aspect of that is it provides a larger base over which to allocate costs of restructuring.
thank you. Mr. Williger, good morning.
Good morning, thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure I should be up here anymore because you basically just said what I was going to say, but I'll just reiterate it for the record. You know, staff agrees that getting folks in the room is a great idea and trying to work through these issues, and we certainly agree we should look to other states for best practices, lessons learned, and even look at their statutory construct to see how they resolve this. But as you said, Mr. Chairman, there's a constitutional amendment that overlays all of this, and it trumps the statute, and we have to look to that constitutional amendment to determine the limits of what we can do that other states have done or haven't done. And I think, we had a fair amount of testimony on Tuesday trying to understand the constitutional amendment. I'm not sure we're there yet. I don't know that we can look at the plain language even of the constitutional amendment to understand it. And so I think that what Mr. Ross said is valuable and important, and we certainly want to look to what other states have done and get everyone in the room. All of that is I wanted to say trumped, but I didn't know if that's a difficult word. All of that is trumped by a constitutional amendment that we have to understand, and that could be challenged if the legislature goes one way and then it wasn't the right way. The Supreme Court could say, wait, that wasn't what this constitutional amendment means. So.
Thank you. And I have you up here, Mr. Williger. And so the main issue we're talking about today is how to best establish a competitive retail market here in Nevada and get that going. Does regulatory operations staff have any suggestions? I've read the written comments, but can walk through any ideas on you think the best way the state should undertake that?
Well, I think we would look to our existing statutes and what are the existing protections customers have, and see if that applies in a new competitive retail market. Let's say or protections, rights, and also obligations. So I think we talked about this in our comments. There's deposit requirements. Does that survive in a competitive retail market? Utilities cannot cut service off for customers if certain temperatures are exceeded or below. Do we look at our existing structure and what do we want to maintain in this new competitive retail market? So, and I also, as Mr. Wood said, we should look to other states. What are the best practices? What are the lessons learned? But I don't want to. I think Ms. Cuneo is going to address this because she's really delved into some of the retail market, and she was here when Nevada tried this before. I think there's going to be mistakes that are going to be made. Things have to be. We have to be nimble as nimble as we can to try to address problems that crop up as they do. So I think we look to our existing rules and statutes, see what we want to survive, how we're going to change now that multiple providers will be providing service, not necessarily just one utility, and with the exception of the munis and co-ops, and also lessons learned, best practices, and how we can incorporate that into our existing, what we want to survive from our existing framework. So, did I answer? I'm not sure if that's I answered your question.
And I was just trying to get more concrete in terms of, kind of next steps in recommendations. Something more clearly, if we're able to, how to go about creating, Mr. Ross, as you mentioned, we have an opportunity to build the best here and to become a model for other states around the country. I mean, we do have that blank canvas, and that's scary, but also that's a huge opportunity. And how do we make sure we do it right? And we are under a clock too. We have a certain amount of years before the clock strikes 12, and we have to have this thing up and running. And
so Ned Ross of Reset, I would be happy to return here and spend a couple days here with your staff and walk them through the Texas statute. I'll have some other folks who are more familiar with Pennsylvania come here. Walk your staff through the Pennsylvania statute. Explain to you how it works. Explain how reliability did not change at all, how it has really nothing to do with electricity. It has to do with transactions, okay? We would be happy to walk through those details, and we absolutely know how overwhelming it can be to look at this and say, how am I going to get my head wrapped around something this large? But we've done it, and we can help you all walk through it piece by piece. Thankfully, these kinds of issues break down into really nice, neat little components. Yesterday we had some conversation about Polar. I went back and refreshed on the Polar rules this morning in Texas. There are 18 pages, just the Polar rules. So it's all there.
And I want to thank you for that offer, and it's something I want to take you up on, because I very much want to, I'm educating myself, and we're learning, I'm learning about this every day.
I know there's a lot of concern about NEM, net metering, how that's going to work. We've addressed that. Now, Texas doesn't have net metering, okay? But we've had statutory language proposed that would have had very stringent net metering language imposed. And essentially what it says is this: the retail provider will provide all the services and electricity to the customer. And in addition to that, the retail provider will offer net metering services to the customer, okay? And if the customer produces more electricity than it consumes, this is how we're going to deal with it. This is the price to compensate them, or this is what happens to that power. All those things can be drafted in statutory language and dealt with. So it's not as though retail providers can't handle that. We understand that. In other jurisdictions, we're dealing with it already. So all that is drafted in the language, and that's the opportunity I'm referring to, is that you all can do that your way.
And I appreciate that. I mean, I always think of in ancient Greece, they had the Oracle Delphi, which says, know thyself, and a part of that is knowing what you don't know, in recognizing what we do know, and also as a state what we don't know, and then looking to who may know the answers to that, and not being afraid to ask for that help. I think that's hugely important.
Please do.
And so I very much appreciate that, because I think we will need, as a state collectively, as much experience and insight as we can from all types of areas and different sources in order to get this right.
Very good.
Mr. Volz, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Chairman. One suggestion on the due diligence process of how this might all work, in the same way that we need some sort of an idea about cost on all the various aspects of this initiative, if it was to pass, I think we need to know who might be coming into the state. And it would be very interesting for RISA or whomever to do an informal polling based on what these companies know about how this market may develop. And if it develops, are they interested in coming? And looking at the RISA website, there are 10 of their members who have some sort of operation in California, which would give them geographic proximity to Nevada. The members who are operating in the Northeast and some of the more distant areas probably aren't necessarily viable candidates for us. Nevertheless, we should just put it out there and see what they have to say. And that would also help inform what sort of consumer protections we need to have on marketing, slamming type activities. We don't want to go through the same process in the initial phase of the solar net metering, where people were badgered constantly and given a hard sell on their doorsteps, as well as by email and by phone. Thank you.
No, thank you. And one thing with respect to the consumer protections piece, and that's something I think, at least here, not focusing as much on as the Governor's Committee on Energy Choice has a workshop on that, because I think at least that's doable in a lot of regards of enacting those consumer protections within the confines of the statute. We're not creating, we have consumer protections in place, and whether it's the Bureau of Consumer Protections, the consumer protections here at the Public Utilities Commission, and other resources, and we can direct resources and create new provisions to account for those. At least in my mind, and again, anyone can come up and I'll get to you in just a second, Ms. Cuneo. My sense is some of the companies that are looking at Nevada, that there's interest, and I've heard the interest of, even as the chair of the commission, different businesses expressing that to me, that they're watching Nevada and very interested in Nevada. But whether they're fully able to commit, they're looking at seeing what we build and seeing what kind of paradigm and structure is in place, what type of requirements to participate in the retail market are set before they want to commit and say, Nevada is definitely a place that they want to step into. There's certainly, they have that interest, but I haven't seen that list, Mr. Volz, that you've expressed, because that's something I've thought about. We, here at a high level, there's a tremendous amount of interest, but I haven't seen a list with 20 names of businesses on it either.
Well, if I may, Fred
Yes,
Volz,
go ahead, please.
An expression of interest is not any sort of a commitment. So I think the point to be made is we want to see if there really are viable people interested. On some basis, it should be publicly noticed. And more importantly, what sort of a track record do they have as operators? And are they companies that we really are going to have a positive impact if the initiative passes, should they come to this state?
And I agree with you. The expression of interest isn't a commitment. And I think when we open something up to a free market, part of it is we can't mandate a commitment. Right now the commitment we have is from NV Energy, is that they're here. And but when we open that up, different entities are allowed to come and leave and participate or not participate as they choose. And there's a risk to that, and that's something else I wanted to get into later today, especially with concerns of the provider of last resort. But before I go further, Director Cuneo, please go ahead.
Thank you. So, it's kind of funny. My master's thesis and research focused on socialized economic systems. So my specialty was Russia and China. And and it's funny because, centralized planning is essentially what we have here, right? And the transition from a centralized planning economy to a market economy, like what happened in Russia in the 90s, it is a similar one that we have today. We've got to find what the correct institutional structures that need to be in place. Most find it more reasonable to go top down, so start with your wholesale market, rules, structures, and then work your way down into retail market and structures. You've got to have your rules and your laws which govern the transactions. How are those transactions going to look? You're going to have to layer on top of all of that whatever your social policies are. So even though you might have decided that this sort of transaction is the way you want transactions to occur, if that transaction leads to the minimization of a social policy that you might have, you've got to figure out how to rewrite that to accomplish your social policy. All of which, then has to be considered with your concerns and your consumer protections. Economics is known as the dismal science, so sometimes I'm going to sound like a little bit of a Debbie Downer here, but it's mostly because I'm a bit of a realist, and I hear a lot of people say we want to get it right, and I want to get it right. And when I was here 20 years ago, when I was first hired to do this the first time, we thought we were going to get it right, but with hindsight, there were a lot of things that we would have gotten wrong. And I want to be honest with everyone that, regulators and market makers, we're gonna get something wrong. There will be a hiccup, a problem, a flaw. No market has ever transitioned and not had some sort of hiccup, some sort of flaw. And as long as the regulators can be nimble enough to fix it, and to, you know, get on, identify and solve problems as they crop up, you can minimize the harm, hopefully. But to believe that there won't be any harm ever to any class of any citizen in Nevada is, well, it's naive. It's not going to happen. There's going to be a hiccup somewhere. So I just wanted to caution that there will be missteps. Regulators aren't perfect. You know, marketers aren't perfect. There will be, but as long as the state is set up the rules and the structures in a manner so that we can react to them, and we or whatever the agency in charge of enforcing them can react to those, is more important than believing that we're going to get it perfectly the first time. Anyway, so to address the other point with respect to how to go about creating a retail market, you know, like I said, the top-down approach is important, but you also have to look at the bottom, which of course is the polar obligation, which I think you said we're going to talk about later. But the polar obligation, just, you know, think broadly. That doesn't have to be one entity. That can be multiple entities. You can have a polar obligation with, instead of an entity, with a tariff. You can have a set of rates that, okay, at a minimum, this is the worst deal you can offer customers, and all of the competitors who are providing service in the state have to offer that. That's your worst deal. So, you know, there are different structures and that you can implement. It doesn't have to be an institution. It can be a result based on you know, a characterization of the market, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And then the final thing I wanted to, you know, to mention also was, you know, we've had 125 years at the PUC of regulating in a certain manner. It's going to take some time and some hiccups to maneuver. So patience. That's the other thing that people are going to need, is patience in order to get the market to work in the way that we want it. It'll take lots of rounds of this.
No, and thank you. And you know, that builds on one of the reasons that I wanted to start these day one of the workshops talking about the scope of the ballot petition and the language, and the ability to correct the hiccups. I think if our goal can always be perfection, and that should be what we try to achieve, but as we're all human, we don't always get there. But also the ability to correct those, you know, smooth out those problems. And you know, traditionally, you know, a pure competitive market capitalist will say, well, eventually a market it'll self-correct. And but sometimes that can take a long time to do if you believe in that, you know, pure laissez-faire, you know, Adam Smith capitalist structure. Reason why we partly have regulators is to help correct that, or to step in. And I think what we heard, at least from Tuesday's workshop, is at least the drafters of this language, you know, it's re-regulation, not deregulation, and that there's still a regulatory role, and to step in and help smooth those things over if they should arise. Ultimately, what the extent of that is would be up to the Nevada Supreme Court, and I think it's the uncertainty of that creates some questions.
And to you know, take off on what Mr. Volz had said with the providers that want to provide service. Again, when we did this prior, the theory for the polar was to actually auction off that right, was to find out who would be willing to pay for the right to provide default service to the state of Nevada. And at the time, there were only 2 entities that were interested in providing that default service. From my memory, it was Shell Energy Services and Enron. So, you know, there were entities that were willing to do that once the rules had been written, that laid out what the the steps were. So again, you won't know what the answer is. You won't know if anybody's gonna come to your party until the rules of your party is out there, until you have the date, time, place. And then you'll find out whether or not it's gonna be a rave.
And I want to go first, before I go to you, Mr. Ross, go down to Las Vegas to see there's a gentleman up at the microphone. Good morning, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Jim Wadhams. I'm with the law firm of Fenimore Craig, and pleased to have the opportunity to speak. I'll try to be brief and appreciate being recognized, because I think my comment was on the very opening question you raised, and that is the wholesale versus retail market.
And I apologize for keeping you waiting this morning, Mr. Wadhams. I'm battling a head cold and my eyes aren't working the best.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a very brief comment, because it appears that the discussion is moving more towards the nuts and bolts, but I thought the opening question was worth a comment, and that has to do with the wholesale versus retail. And the answers I think you got were accurate, but I want to emphasize one component that might be easily overlooked, and that is that the wholesale market is also for buying in bulk, in addition to for resellers to buy at the wholesale market for the purpose of commercial resale. The organization I represent is the Nevada Rural Electric Association, and the commissioner is familiar generally with who we are. We represent the buyers. The buyers have come together in voluntary associations in public utility, in utility districts under Chapter 318 and municipalities. So they go to the market to buy, and they buy in the wholesale market at bulk. The interesting thing, Mr. Chairman, that you've drawn our attention back to, and I think appropriately, is the language of the constitutional initiative itself. And should it pass, it clearly identifies that associations of persons and political subdivisions, of which constitute our membership, can purchase anywhere they want, which means the wholesale market, or in a competitive retail market. So in the future, we may be buyers in one or other of the market, one that hasn't been established yet, the retail market, or we will continue to buy in the wholesale market, which raises a point that we've mentioned in several of our comments, and I just reemphasize it. These are voluntary associations of consumers, of customers who elect a board of directors. Their solutions have been done internally. So I think the good news in this potential future is that customers have opportunities. If they don't want to expose themselves singly to the retail market, they can associate with other customers, gain some bulk, and create solutions for themselves. So I only raise that, Mr. Chairman, in that to remind all of us as we go down this process that there are segments of the state of Nevada, granted in terms of power consumption, probably 15 to 20% of the state, but have been customer-based, customer-oriented purchasers in a wholesale market. We're interested in this process. We'll continue to participate and be happy to answer any questions, but we will be continuing to attend these hearings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wadhams, and I see Mr. Hank James is in the audience up here in Carson City. But I really appreciate your participation, and I apologize again for keeping you waiting at the microphone down in Las Vegas. Mr. Ross, go ahead, please.
Ned Ross, just a couple of quick observations on the heels of the other comments. Fred had mentioned, and I hear his name, but I'm not exactly sure how to spell it or say it, so I don't want to say it, but Fred's comments were who's going to show up to the party, basically. I would suggest that if you build it right, they will come. Realize that many of the providers across the country are smaller companies. One of the decisions you have to make here is, what will your requirements to enter this market be? Will they be very rigid? Will they be capital intensive? Will they be small? How small of a company do we want to invite to this market? Texas wanted all sizes, and so their capital entry requirements were very low. It was very entrepreneurial, and you had these small companies come in and create boutique businesses out of retail electric sales. So I will just suggest to you that you don't see all these parties in the room because it's expensive to go back and forth and be here for a week at a time. But there are probably tens of companies that are standing by watching this proceeding. If you create this market in a way that invites them to come at a reasonable cost, they will be here. If there's an opportunity for profit, and your rules are such that they're fairly standardized to the other markets they operate in, they don't have to make massive changes to their systems, for example, to meet customers' needs and carry billing data and all that kind of thing. That kind of standardization goes a long way to allowing people very economically to enter this market. Keep in mind that much of what we do is electronic today. You don't have to have people going door to door or reading meters on the sides of houses anymore. Much of it can be done remotely. So don't think that just because companies aren't here that they won't show up. People will show up. There are companies waiting and watching to see what's going to happen here. So I would encourage you to just keep that in mind. And then in terms of Polar, we can have a lengthy discussion when you're ready about Polar. But there are several ways we can deal with that, and we can get into that later.
Was the Field of Dreams shot in Texas?
Yes, sir. I was not shot there, but we love the movie. I'm a baseball guy, so I've always loved that movie. Yeah.
Yes, if you build it, they will come.
That's
Absolutely. Right. I want to. You mentioned three kind of points to look at with establishing a retail market. You said a capital. You mentioned a capital. Any capital barriers to entry, and what were the other two?
The requirements to enter?
Yeah.
So the basic rules in Texas, and I would have to go back and review them carefully, I believe it's still $1 million on hand. You have to show that you have $1 million of capital invested in it. You also have to have certain people with experience in each of the roles that are necessary to run a retail provider. So we actually have experience requirements there that you just can't enter the market and not know what you're doing. The regulations are quite comprehensive. The reporting is comprehensive, all those kinds of things. You need to have people that know how to operate in that environment. So, and they always, as I mentioned a couple days ago, they always have the threat of revocation of license if you don't follow the rules. And so you tend to want to have more than enough people on hand who know what they're doing to make sure you follow the rules.
And I think at least in a simpler even way of saying that is, do we want to vet these businesses before we allow them to start serving customers in Nevada to make sure they can do what they're promising and they have the financial wherewithal to make it happen?
Yes, sir. RISA would encourage you to have a very solid vetting process because that bodes well for all of us.
So we weed out the bad actors, we weed out the unstable businesses, so we get good solid businesses serving Nevadans.
Yes, sir, and I would point out that's at the retail level, has to be a retail provider. Also understand that at the wholesale level, when you begin to buy bulk power, you're basically falling under CFTC rules. So are you familiar with the ISDA contract process with wholesale commodities?
No, I'm not.
There are internationally standardized contracts for trading commodities. And you will fall under those kinds of rules that are very standardized. All of the big trading houses and commodities exchanges are familiar with those rules, and those rules require you to post cash or post collateral sufficient to allow you to even function in that market. All that is very heavily regulated, and you all can look at those kinds of rules and make sure they comply with what you want to do. And I'm slowing down for.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah, everyone kind of glances at me, and I try to slow down. But we would encourage you to look at that as well. If any of you can come to another state and see how this works, we would invite you to come join us. I'm happy to give you all tours of our trade floor. If you want to come through and see how our energy trading desk works, we have our own meteorologist. Okay, we have our own people that track prices there. I get a daily price report on every commodity in the energy sector, what's going on around the world. We get data. We're very sophisticated. Have a whole team of people that track 24-hour electricity and natural gas. So it's a really interesting experience to come in and see how this works. And you could go to any state where you have a large enterprise like that, and they'd be happy to work with you and explain it to you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Volz.
And yes, for the record, Fred Volz again. Just playing off of what Mr. Ross was saying, We've actually had that experience in the state with the telecom companies. There have been many of them that came and went. And in fact, there are about 129 fines owed the PUC and the state that have not been collected because the companies disappeared, their principals disappeared. There was nobody to go back to collect those fines given the way they chose to operate. So in addition to any sort of minimum financial requirements, I would suggest some sort of a surety bond going forward to not repeat that same mistake that we've made as a state previously. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been going for about an hour and 15 minutes. We're going to take a 15-minute break until 11:30. Then when we come back, we're going to start talking about the provider of last resorts and the Polar. Thank you.
Yeah, like a steel trap, like a ball bearing.
So tell me, your comment.
Sure. I like the words, I have to do it in preparation for this case that question came from somebody equally uninformed. Well, they okay. Just to be reasonable, we are, here, this is what I call delegation of rights. This gives rights, okay? And most people stop right there. We are an association of persons. We're an association, voluntary association. And a couple of us are political subdivisions. Lincoln County Power District is a 318 power district. Overton Public Power District is a 318 power district. Okay. So Boulder City is a city. So they're all, yeah. So that's we, so I'll just say we have the right to choose our provider, including, but not limited to, providers more better than so I said, we can continue to buy wholesale, or we can buy retail. Yeah, yeah, well, kind of said it, and Ned kind of said it. Yeah, and Ned kind of got to my first point that I wanted to emphasize, because we use the phrase buying in bulk, and then it's sort of people's mind suddenly goes to, well, it's all commercial reselling. But we're not reselling. We go buy it, and we just invoice our customers. There's no commercial interplay, okay? So, wait, the next thing is, the RPS can only be opposed on participants in competitive. So the people who want to be Amazon, Google, and Facebook selling retail, they may have to be under the portfolio standard. Bonneville doesn't. Does the rest of it.
We tried to do the 704B stuff.
So our point really, and it's not that we're not, some of our people like this, because they're afraid that it's too disruptive. The fact of the matter, and you grew up in a fairly rural place, is the reason we even freaking exist is because everything's economically attractive to any investor to invest in utility that's going to go out and serve it. Joe, who lives at the end of the 2.5 mile line, some that are one customer at the end of a 20-mile line.
Karen, how are you?
Yeah, so the next question is, well, does that customer have to buy from you? No. Old Joe out there at the end of that line, he can turn off his power and go diesel. And he'll do that for one growing season. That could be right. Anyway. So I,
this issue right now. Straight you're saying it's not an issue. Those guys,
Who are those guys? Well, you're gonna be calling for a lot.
All right, well, I'm going to use this.
No, here's
you have interests that are all over the
So,
place.
it doesn't have anything to do with what they do.
Unanimous consent, or does
And
recommendation
power
go to the
can't be
governor?
sold
If
to-
you get 6% of the 30 people.
you
or
can't go
what?
buy from
I
Bondo
don't
or
think they know
Waco.
what to do with it,
Right.
and so I think it's just.
And so he was saying, it could be, if you think that
And what,
we're gonna become
you know,
competitive, you're
and
wrong.
not try to
You
come
can't
up
do
with-
that under federal
And
law.
throw on top of
They
the
can't.
legislative interim energy.
They can only sell,
People on that board.
well,
City, right, right,
have
right.
a customer
Well, they have
contract
to do,
that's, it's
And they're the one
evaluated every 2 years.
We're leaving 4 times.
What they do
So I asked,
is they have ranges.
what,
Plus or
I read
minus.
statute, so it's gonna have to do a study on choice, but there's.
5%.
What's the definition
They
of
estimate that they're gonna need
Yeah, what is
plus
the
or minus
study, what is the
5%,
study,
and one
and
opens
where's
in mind,
is there any
it takes them
appropriation that went with?
up 10%.
That went to do this
And
study? I think the answer is no.
That contract
So-
has an amendment to it where they purchase that in the open market and route it back through.
Yeah.
So this provider of last resort issue is built into the arrangements with the suppliers for these fellows. They've had to deal with this for 100 years. Well, so, you know what I'm saying? And so they don't worry about the retailer closing the shop.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But I think the thing is that they don't have to do it in the first
You
session.
need it other.
And I think.
Yeah, so-
The chairman was getting to that, like, what's the first?
So we got
thing to do?
Sutherland on the phone with the general counsel, and
The first thing you
he
do is
explained it to
ask
James.
Texas.
His concern,
Because you don't know, I mean, we don't have a wholesale market, so. You know,
who is it? I can't. BPA, well, Bonneville Power. Well, they're regional, whatever it is. Seattle or down in Oregon. And so a lot of what's happened is like Randy, you will,
They're talking about
other
the
guys,
first day. Fred Wolf was
and
saying.
others, they're just concerned that because there is such a,
We can work on the language once it gets there.
let me take it back.
Fred Wolf,
You're old.
we'll have a lawsuit.
I first got hired by these guys in
And exclude,
1985,
if you wanted to exclude.
because
those
in
groups,
'83, the
you should have done
legislature,
it when it was written,
Keep
instead
that.
of waiting until.
he got it passed, banned electric resistance heating statewide in the energy market. And that's the only way the rural guys get them.
oh, well, so I think this whole issue of.
So they hired me in
that-
'85
I'm
to
sure
come
was
down
asking
to the
about yesterday about
legislature and
renewable
say,
work and we don't want
oh,
more work. I can guarantee.
we're out
that
here.
in the next
And
few
the
years,
legislature
the
was
states
so
are
pissed
gonna
off.
lose a lot
They
of
wanted to repeal
their
the
ability
entire law.
to
And
do
said, no,
some
just do it
big,
for us. Leave the
electricity
urban
policy things,
the way
because
they are.
the
It's not
distribution
efficient
system
in
is
the urban.
acting like the transmission system now.
But
And
it's critical.
and we.
The point I'm trying to make
we
here
were
is that
working
from the
on-
very
I
beginning,
mean, in my
and
process,
probably through history of time,
over that
people think that
distribution-
these are
first
meaning
having
investor-owned
the
utilities
distribution
like
system,
NV
because
Energy. They're not. They're fine
because
coal.
of cybersecurity issues and because of the interconnectedness of distributed resources in the world, in anything, and then influence the transmission system.
Distributors.
Should have-
Well, that's exactly what we do.
ended
We,
up
listen,
back
if you
off
go to
because
Mount, you go
the
to
state
any one of
went
these
nuts.
places,
But we did get nerve to
every
acknowledge
inch
that,
of wire
and
in
for
Lincoln County is
both of them
owned
acknowledge that
by every
in the
resident
instance of distribution
in Lincoln County. They actually
system
own
disturbance that
the
affected the
physical
transmission system,
plant.
that there was.
They're just water, they're just distribution wire.
But there, I mean,
And
this
if
whole
they elect
FERC
a board,
technical or
that
conference
board
effort
hires
lays
you.
out the influence of state
You go
policies. I just
into
sent her, I maybe I printed
the
it out.
international
I just,
wholesale energy
the-
market and get the best deal
really,
with spinning reserves and
staff report that the
flexibilities. You
secretary
don't have
wants
to
it
provide
up.
all that.
They
Your customer
read
can
through
tell you.
all the comments from
And
that.
then your board
technical
sits down with the
and
customer's
I
input,
printed it out.
and
So
they
anyway,
do
I can
They do
figure
the
out.
rate making.
It
And
talks about
distribution of cost, yeah,
Terry
you
and
go fight.
former
I equate this
They're all
to
saying, you know, you can't
This is
stop
just
legislature
like
from doing anything, but for sure, state
five
policy
of us
is
go out
affecting
and
wholesale
beer.
markets.
Turns
So
out
pretty soon, there's gonna be some
your alligator arms, you didn't
more
bring your go.
influence on the state's
say, okay.
ability to do this stuff, so.
I'll buy the beer,
it's
and
gonna
I'll
happen.
collect for me tomorrow.
Even if you
So,
don't, even if you're not in a wholesale market, just because.
am I a reseller?
The distribution system is changing.
Well, if I have a $10 big on that, maybe I am, but if I'm just going back and collecting the beer, yeah. Cost plus a tip. So,
Yeah,
that's what these
so,
guys do.
so this is where
They
I,
can't, they can't deliver power.
I actually commissioned some people.
Clay,
to be
Clay
on,
Pitts, who's
um,
your
discussion.
just off the
And then,
blades,
and then,
I'm
I
not
can't remember if
fine
that
with being
other
able-
technology, but you're right, and this is just,
You can do that.
this is challenging states. And you, so even if you don't,
Yeah.
even if you're not reset.
But you owe
sort of have to go through
your
this
fellow
anyway
members
because of what's happening behind the meter. But unfortunately,
for running that wire out there.
it's being set up.
That's a stranded cost.
Weird, it's just a weird way to think about it.
It's all done internally.
Regulatory environment.
That's an added piece. The members own the maintenance that has to be justified. We have
How do
meetings.
they mostly do that? They contract that, or do they actually have a staff?
Most of the staff.
If they put in new wires, it's blended into the.
It's blended into the whole base and the cost is amortized over the entire membership. So, you know, that 16, just use that my example, that 16 miles of wire is worth, hell, that's worth, let's say it's worth $5,000. Just copper, what is it? Now it becomes a part of the asset base for the members for their annual deal. They have capital credits that reflect their value in that.
Just think about, you know, Becker's camp up here in
Mhm.
Charleston. They're about 5 miles from of course, that's not a REA or co-op thing, but that's why they did solar panels. There's, I don't know how many thousands of dollars gonna take to run 5 miles.
No, I know.
Power line.
Oh, I was wondering if my phone was even
Yeah.
here, because I was supposed to get a call,
Solar.
Well, and that's in the
I'm
beginning, you
basically
don't
sitting
mean
on
to be
the phone.
negative,
No,
I'm just
maybe
saying.
that's why it didn't ring.
When you get stockholders, that's why, that's what we
The other day,
regulate,
I had,
that's
I
for
was supposed to,
utilities,
somebody was
because
to
the
call me
stockholders
in,
want
and I
more
did
money,
not see the
which
voicemail.
pulls prices up maybe unfairly,
And I got
you know,
three
we gotta
bars.
find a balance. And for my little guys, there's no separation. So we just are constantly trying to calm our guys down. No, they can't make you cancel your contract with Bonneville.
Well, that's good to know. I mean,
How could you do that anyway? That's forget this constitutional amendment, that's unconstitutional
Rotary.
under the state and federal constitution.
Yeah.
I'm glad you showed up today.
You could leave today,
Normally I'm not. So,
I can trust you.
life is good.
I got you. Life is interesting. This is, and I think this cycle is gonna be fabulous.
How do you think this government race is going?
You know, I think Christie is gonna surprise a lot of people that I don't think it's this like. son that lives north of Montana now, he lives up on the, you know, that horse country is up like a Rome Boulevard up. Actually, it's north of the end, it's north of kind of that, yeah, that way, yeah, that's all residential out there now. My number 4 kid bought a house out there, horses and dogs.
It's just like, these two keep the maintenance for these two little friggin' house. Take out half your day.
He's got quite a menagerie. He got him female, so he's got 2 horses, so he doesn't have to wear, you know, he can trade during the course of the day, or some over or what. Yeah, so he's got 2 horses, and I've been taking care of his dogs for a couple of years. So now he has place where he can take care of the dogs, and he said, well, Dad, I'll put your dog along with my dogs, because they're kind of together. So, and he had 2 dogs, and he gets married to this girl, and she has a dog, and that's free. And then they went out, and have Katie, her kids, of course, the dad's permission, so now they got 4 dogs. 4 dogs, 2 horses, and a kid. Now they have 2 dogs.
I just thought, yeah, I'm trying to find somebody to take care of the dogs. Why, I think that if you move my mother-in-law's house, it's driving around the water pile there.
Yeah.
But I noticed today it was out, so it was like, taking one down the corner. I had 2 apples. What do you have, critters?
Let's see. But Jimmy's, right now, I have no dogs at my house. My daughter Katie lives 4 houses away. She has an old chocolate lab and a brand new silver lab, which is a gray one, very unusual. Little puppy, just a chewing puppy. And out at Jimmy's house, there is an old yellow lab, German Shepherd. Fluffy, Shih Tzu, something other, whatever it was. And then of course, it's 2 little ones, 2 big ones.
We are back on the record in docket number 17-1001 for day 3 of the Energy Choice Initiative workshops at the Public Utilities Commission. Prior to the break, I mentioned wanted to come back and discuss at more length about is what we often refer to as the PULR, which is the acronym for Provider of Last Resort. In my understanding, I would explain it is the baseline of service that needs to be provided to any customer in Nevada. And the context of why this is so important is, as I discussed last week, and I think everybody understands, energy and electricity is different than other commodities. It can be a life or death type situation. Everyone needs it. We need it for refrigeration, air conditioning, cooking, medical equipment, and if you go on and list what those factors are for our modern way of life. And so we need a situation where every Nevadan has it reliably, affordably, whether rich or poor, and what part of the state you live in. You know, we have over 100,000 square miles in the state of Nevada, and that's a lot of area. And we have very rural places in the state, as well as significant metropolitan places such as Las Vegas and Reno. And we need to make sure that all Nevadans, all Nevadan businesses always have their lights come on, and they do so in a way that they can afford them, and afford that monthly bill. And in my mind, when we talk about choice, is to me, that means more than one. And so if you say somebody has a provider of last resort, that means there's one option, one entity that will serve a customer. If that's all there is, that's not necessarily a choice. And so as we're looking at creating a constitutional right to choice and to have meaningful choice, does the language in this ballot petition contemplate that there needs to always be at least an option for residents to pick from? So at least a minimum of two in any given area. I don't know the answer to that question. That's just a question in my mind. Again, when we're talking about a constitutional right, if there is only one energy provider who serves Humboldt County, and the residents of that county have no one else to even, they won't have a choice. There'll just be one provider. And would that then therefore become unconstitutional? Do we need to look at a situation where there's always at least two for residents or businesses to pick from? Again, that's an open question in my mind. And any thoughts on that, I would appreciate. Because again, we're looking at a constitutional amendment that guarantees a right. And that's different than other states have done. With respect to the provider of last resort, I think there's several options that the Nevada State Legislature can choose from. And I think one Director Cuneo mentioned is that we could set a base tariff, a base service plan, setting the minimum rate, the minimum terms of service that are required for anyone who's going to come to Nevada to participate in the marketplace. And so that's kind of the guarantee, the safety net that all Nevadans and businesses for their prospective rate class will be guaranteed. And any businesses that want to come in and do better than that can offer that. That's an option, or there's other models, I think, to look at from the provider of last resort. Well, it's my understanding that NV Energy, and they've made this clear from the outset of this conversation, is that they have no interest and intent to be the provider of last resort. And so, in my view, in 2023, when the constitutional provision comes into effect, their obligation to provide those services goes away. And we need to make sure that there's someone else to pick that up flawlessly and seamlessly so nobody loses their lights. And so with respect to provider of last resort, to me, this is also one of the more difficult issues, because businesses, I imagine the only reason that they would want to come to Nevada is to make money. I mean, that's what businesses do, and that's not a bad thing. They want to make a profit. And so how do we structure the requirements of being a provider of last resort, also with an ability for businesses to come to Nevada to make a profit? Because that's ultimately what they want to be able to do. And we need them to be able to do, because that's how capital economy works. And so is there any ideas or suggestions on the best way to approach this polar question? Anyone wants to give it a try? Thank you, Mr. Wellinghoff.
Thank you, Chairman Reynolds, Chairman Wellinghoff for ECI, for the record. I think the polar is sort of a critical question around making sure that this whole structure works effectively. To address your initial question about, do we need to ensure that there is more than one? I think what we need to ensure is that that the legislature provides for meaningful choice, I think is what the ballot initiative says, paraphrasing to some degree. And if they set up that structure, and if there are certain areas where only one shows up, then I think only one shows up. I mean, ultimately, I still think that would conform to the intent and the letter of the law as set forth. So I would hope that wouldn't be the case. I would hope that there would be areas where there would be, in most areas of the state, where there would be at least 2 or more providers. Let me give you one example where even in fairly tiny markets, I think we're going to see some robust competition. I just came from Alberta, Canada. I was in Calgary. I consult with a large utility client there, a generator client, a utility in the sense that the whole province has been restructured, and I don't call it re-regulation, I call it restructuring, where they do have a competitive wholesale market and they have a competitive retail market. But the retail market is actually very small, even though the total load in Alberta is about 10,000 megawatts. Only about 10 or 12% of that is residential, because a huge portion of it is industrial, commercial, the oil sands, as you can imagine. That whole part of the load is the predominant part of the load, is 80+% of the load. And so fairly tiny amount is residential. However, they have a very robust residential competitive market where they have retailers competing for that market. In fact, I was watching TV, and you get these ads on TV of people soliciting you to choose them as their new provider for services. So I think we can set up a proper structure with respect to the polar. Let me suggest a number of things. In the areas where we currently have a for-profit entity providing service, certainly the polar, I think, should be some kind of a competitive structure. I don't know exactly what kind of a competitive structure it should be. Anne-Marie Cuneo mentioned back in '99 when we were trying to restructure then, and I was actually in that process then as well. I was the staff counsel to the commission. We did have 2 entities who wanted to do that, although now that there are much more robust retail markets in the country, I think we'll have many more entities who will consider being the polar. So in those areas where we want to go to retail competition, in the areas where we have the current monopoly retail provider, I think it should be some kind of a competitive situation. In those areas of the state, however, predominantly the rural areas, where we have a government entity or a nonprofit entity that's serving a current retail base, a current load, I would suggest that we give that entity a ROFR, as they call it, a right of first refusal, to be the polar. So if you give them, in essence, they could be the provider of first resort, in essence, in those areas, in the co-ops and the munis in Fallon and Boulder City and Valley Electric and Wells Rural and the other areas that are served by those governmental or nonprofit entities. And they could set up a structure that would be akin to sort of the community choice aggregation structures that are set up in California or 7 other states, where they could still preserve their co-op membership structure or their municipal utility structure, still serve customers. They would be the provider of last resort that all customers would default into. And if a customer did so choose to go to another provider, and there was another provider who wanted to provide competitive service in that area, that I think we would have to allow it under the Constitution, under the amendment as proposed. But I think it would give them some comfort, at least, that they can retain their service territory, their customers, and can provide that service to them.
Is there any thought or value in the idea? I would imagine, the big population areas in the state is where more money can be made, just because we have and that would just, to me, make business sense. Las Vegas area, again, Washoe County, Carson City, tying in anyone who wanted to provide service in the higher populated areas, that they need to also service certain rural areas is kind of a condition of serving in certain metropolitan areas, or is that not even a good idea?
I'll give it an initial try. I think by doing that, you're going to reduce the ability for, the more restrictions you put on a retail provider, obviously, the more restrictions are going to result in lower participation in the market ultimately. I'm not sure it's necessary if we provide for this other structure where in essence the existing underlying muni or co-op in fact has the first right to serve, and they do preserve their structure, because I would anticipate that 99% of their customers are going to stay with them, because I also do anticipate that they're still going to be able to have provided to them their federal preference contracts. Those are not going to go away. And they're going to be able to provide, they will be in essence the low-cost provider as well, ultimately, in those rural jurisdictions. So as the low-cost provider, I think there's going to be very few instances where customers are actually going to want to seek out an alternative competitive provider. So I don't know that it would be necessary or useful for us to impose that kind of a restriction on those people who are retail providers who are providing service in the otherwise monopoly service.
And that was just an idea, just kind of thinking aloud. Maybe that's a dangerous thing to do, because the way, the analogy, at least in my mind, that I'm thinking about this issue and my concern with it is, I think of the Affordable Care Act and how with the Affordable Care Act it essentially mandated, you know, a base level of insurance that needed to be offered. And later we found out in certain areas of even Nevada, I want to say, I think in the Nye County area, we had situations where no insurance provider wanted to provide that base level of insurance because in their view, you know, it was no longer economical. And then so there was even no one there, so to speak, to be provider, the puller. Right. And how do we ensure that that situation doesn't happen in Nevada, where we just have a region and no business says we can't make money doing that? Why would we want to go in there and do that?
Well, certainly in those areas of the state where there are not now an existing governmental or nonprofit entity that's serving retail providers that are, i.e. in NV Energy service territory, we should have a puller everywhere that does, a competitively provided puller that will provide services to everybody. There's no question.
Because right now, again, I have the authority at the commission to tell NV Energy they have to. You have to go, drive your truck those several hundred miles and service them, and that's just the way it is. And when I lose that ability, how do we make sure that that's still in place? Mr. Ross.
Mr. Chairman, Ned Ross for RISA. I have a little different approach to this, and I think you may just have to kind of close your eyes and think differently for a little bit, but go back to our wonderful baseball field of dreams analogy here. If you build it the correct way, we don't care, okay? So one of the things that Pat Wood did when he set up the market in Texas is he realized that if you put the transmission assets all into a pool and share the cost of transmission, not distribution, but transmission, that the cost of service is the same across the whole ERCOT footprint, okay? So that cost to us is just it is what it is, and that's in a bill. It's standardized, okay? When you get to the distribution system to deliver that power to the household, each distribution system has its own discrete rates that are set by the commission, okay? What that did was, it made our job of selling to different customers far easier, more standardized, far cheaper to deploy. So we were then able to just load that into our systems, and at that point, we didn't care where a customer resided on a system. They were just a customer that we were going to serve.
So you're saying that the geography didn't matter so much?
That's correct. It didn't matter at all. And I was just having this conversation in the hall with another gentleman, and I was telling him, it doesn't matter to us. If you structure the market the right way, in a standardized fashion, that we don't know if a customer on its face is in remote eastern Nevada or in downtown Las Vegas, because their rates are essentially the same with the exception of that distribution component, we're going to serve them. There would be no reason why any provider would come in and say, I don't want that customer, because they're all customers. They're all opportunities for us to sell. The only thing that you'll differentiate, and you see in every other state that is competitive, billboards, television ads, radio spots, all those media opportunities to advance your brand, you're not going to do that in a town of 200 people. It's not cost effective. The major metropolitan areas get the money spent on the branding, but that's really the only differentiation. Other than that, we just look at a customer on, say, the Encore service territory. They've got a certain rate that we pay. It's loaded into our system. The Encore service territory covers hundreds and hundreds of square miles, thousands, tens of thousands of square miles. It's a very large territory. We don't differentiate. It's the same customer. So each of those customers can have a slightly different rate depending on what distribution company they're on. For example, the rates in the valley are slightly higher because it's a smaller system. It's a bit more expensive. The rates in the other territories are a bit lower, but that's really it. Other than that, they're customers. So we've heard a lot of concerns about, are you ever going to serve the rural customers? I say yes, absolutely we'll serve them. As long as you structure the market in a way that our cost of service doesn't go up to serve those smaller customers, everybody will be treated the same. And in terms of Polar, I told you we have 18 pages of rules. They're very comprehensive. The Texas market said we don't want default, we don't want the utility to remain in the business. In much the same way NV Energy has said they don't want to remain. If they wish to, great. Let's let them be a default provider. But the authority said we don't want the utility to compete in any way with the competitive market. So we want the competitors to take this obligation on. So Polar in Texas is done by us. If you're a larger company and they take about the top 15 providers each year based on how much we sell, they break it down into the types of customers and they say, you top 15 are Polar providers, okay? Other smaller providers can participate. They can voluntarily elect to join as a Polar provider. The commission then, if a Polar event occurs, which has been very rare over 15 years, okay, I think we've had maybe 2, I'd have to verify. But if you have an event where customers are no longer able to get service from their provider because they've gone bankrupt or their license has been revoked or whatever, and that those customers then have to go find another provider, it's seamless. Those customers go to the Polar group that's already established, and then we get those customers, some share of those customers in our book, and we then have to manage them. So it's a very well thought out process. It's been modified over time in different ways, but it works beautifully. And like I say, we don't often have a Polar event. Let me tell you why. When a provider is about to have a financial problem or is about to exit the market, the first thing they do is go out and try and sell their book of business to another provider. And we've had multiple occasions where, for whatever reason, a provider wanted to exit the market and they just sold their book off and there was never a Polar event. So it doesn't happen often. If it's going to happen, it is organized. It's well established. The expectations we have are that we could wind up with a share of somebody's business over time. That's just the cost of doing business. We can manage that.
And I think that's really important, and thank you for sharing that, because in my mind I have thought a lot about the Polar issue in terms of geography. And maybe that's not the right way to think about it. But that's the default thinking, at least in my process, at this point. And I think it's important to look at it from that other angle. If that geography issue is important with respect to how this retail market is structured. If a customer right now has a smart meter in their home, whether it's in Ely or downtown North Las Vegas, should it not make a difference?
I think there are opportunities here. And I think Mr. Wellinghoff is right there, and I think you're right to kind of say maybe that's not the great thing to do, to mandate somebody to have to serve a customer in an area to make sure everyone is served. And the reason would be that you might take away an opportunity for someone to create a nice niche business in a rural community. Maybe they want to become a retail provider and serve their neighbors.
Well,
So there's a balance there that must be struck that you don't discourage folks from entering the market.
And I think, getting back to the conversation on Tuesday, is my understanding of this petition is we want to create that opportunity. We want to create business growth. We want to create economic development, the entrepreneurship that's associated with opening this up. Not discourage it, but encourage it. But in doing so right now, whether somebody lives in $1 million home in Las Vegas, or an apartment in Story County or Lyon County or somewhere, NV Energy has to service them with the same level. And want to make sure that that basic level of service, regardless of income, socioeconomic status, stays the same. In when we're stepping away from that, don't want to create kind of a different class structure, so to speak, of in the energy world.
And I don't think you'll see that.
Okay.
I think what you'll see is companies coming in to serve as many customers as they can, because there are economies of scale at work here. We don't differentiate, and the PUC ensures that we don't differentiate between socioeconomic classes. There are federal guidelines that prohibit us from discriminating based on other characteristics. Doesn't happen. That stuff is very rigidly followed. And interestingly, there's a lot of data that we have done on low-income customers and the needy and folks like that. And I'll just share with you one data point that we found in Texas, and that is the lowest income customers, those that struggle the most, are not the biggest bad debt challenge that we have. That they are actually customers that are proud and they pay their bills. And so we have no problems serving those customers. They're actually quite good.
Thank you. And I'm going to go down to Vegas to Mr. Wadhams, and then Mr. James, I'll go to you. Mr. Wadhams, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Just again, for the record, this is Jim Wadhams with Nevada Rural Electric. It's interesting to hear the discussion of the rural areas. I just want to make a comment. The people that we generally become associated with, that associate with us, are those that have no choice and had no choice. And I think it sort of begs a question when we decide whether they are going to be Wells Rural or Mount Wheeler will be a provider of last resort. They really are a procurer of first resort. They are the result of people coming together to find energy in the first place. The suggestion is made that perhaps these electrons will now become available across the state, and that may well be true. I think the point I want to make sure is on the record is that these organizations are largely membership organizations in which the membership rights are coextensive with each other member. And I think the elements of dropping your membership, that is terminating your service, are certainly available within the context of those organizations. And so, again, I'm suggesting that as we look at the constitutional amendment that allows the right of association, I think we have to be mindful that we have to then respect the rights of those members in their association, which really leads to the ultimate question of those members through their bylaws, through their plans of operations, and their democratic process address these issues. Should electricity become more widely available in these areas, in O'Neill Basin up somewhere between Wells and Jackpot, that's wonderful. But I think that the membership notion of these organizations is going to have to be respected. The organizations are there to satisfy their owners. So it sort of clouds the issue, I think, Mr. Commissioner, to conflate that with the intent of this constitutional amendment to open up what was otherwise an integrated monopoly. That's not the circumstance in the rural areas. They've had no monopoly. They have been the first resort, the last resort, and the only resort. So I appreciate the discussion going that way, but I don't think that's the place to start. I think the issue, and I think Mr. Wellinghoff identified it, our members are not likely to go anywhere because they are, in fact, members. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Williams, and I think that's a really important perspective in again, just having this dialogue, this conversation, and I think providing some of that clarity and explanation is important. I asked it because it was a question in my mind, but it wasn't anything that was a decision by any way in my mind. I'm trying to probe the different areas and implications of this. And so thank you for that. Mr. James, go ahead.
Sure. Hank James, for the record. I'm the Executive Director of the Nevada Rural Electric Association, and I certainly appreciate Mr. Wadham's information, because he articulated what I wanted to say a lot better, I'm sure. The bottom line for me is, and the point I think that is becoming more clear, and that we want to make sure is clear, is that Polar and customers are a foreign concept to Nevada Rural Electric Association members. We are the customers. We don't have customers. We're not a retail distributor. We don't do that. We procure energy based on the direction that our owners tell us to buy. And that's it. And we buy only for our owners, only for the people who are in our PUC regulated service territory. But our bylaws mandate, our individual bylaws mandate that we provide service to anybody who wants it on a voluntary basis. So Polar is a foreign concept. We are, as Mr. Wadham said, we are the procurer of first resort and the last resort and the only resort. And that's the way it's been for 50 years plus, and it seems to bring in the lowest cost form of energy through those federal contracts, and I think that that needs to be preserved for the economic sustainability of rural Nevada. So,
No, thank you for that. Anything further on this, Mr. Ross?
Yeah, Ned Ross with RISA. I would just say the cooperatives have a long, proud history. They have a place in our electric grid. If the constitutional amendment requires all Nevadans to have a choice, they can continue to operate as co-ops. But I think folks behind those co-ops may prefer to have a choice. And I think that's the power of choice, is that they can decide to stay with the co-op or not. And it sounds to me like they have opportunities in many of these co-ops and municipalities to receive low-cost energy through hydro contracts, and that's a delightful situation for them, and I would suspect they would want to stay with that enterprise. How you decide to structure that will determine how the co-ops can continue to function in this market, but there is a place for them to do that, and there is a way for them to do that.
Thank you. Hello, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Reynolds. This is Chris Township from Valley Electric. As you know, in our comments, we said that we would be interested in being the provider of last resort.
Yes, I was going to mention that at some point. I think you were the only entity that I saw that came out fully and said that you had that interest.
Well, thank you. There's kind of three components to this. One is we are the provider of last resorts as the rules in our remote areas, and I'm talking remote areas in Nevada. And we look forward to doing that because we meet the needs of our members, and we're looking forward to meeting the needs in the future of those same group of individuals. We also separated into, for the NVE members, or the customers of NVE. So we look at it as the third spot is we would be also interested in being a retail provider of other entities who might be interested in choice, like in NVE's service territory. So we look at it as an opportunity that continue to allow the boards in the districts and the rurals continue to do what they're doing today, and that is managing what they're good at doing. Look at it in the future as if you're going to break it out between a service provider, a provider of last resort, or a retail energy provider. There's a differential between them. One is the end stop customer versus one who's wanting to be there. So there may be another option there as well. So in a summary, that's kind of the three avenues that we've looked at. And we would be interested in working with the commission. You know, we don't have a specific plan set in place right now, but we're interested in looking at it and saying, what is it that the state wants, what's the legislator wants, what does the PUC want, and yet at the same time maintaining that autonomy of those local REAs, Mount Wheelers, those guys, in addition to us, the other Nevada members who want to have choice.
Are you able to share at this point, and it's okay if the answer is no, but I'm going to ask, what type of model for a polar, if the legislature was going to set that, would be most attractive to Valley Electric Association?
Go the next step with me, and give me a little more to work with, please.
For example, one construct is, as Director Cuneo had mentioned, you know, if we set just a base tariff, you know, throughout the state that set a minimum service plan and rate that anyone who wanted to participate in the retail market would have to be able to offer. Or do we go and designate you know, specific entities having to provide a polar function?
Well, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to speak like a lawyer. So, and that is, we're open to what the legislative bodies are. You know, again, going back to let the local co-ops make a decision about what's best for them. Look at the other group being the Nevada retail customers who are out there, and then just figure out what the legislature gives us direction to do, and then let's figure a model out to do that.
And the reason I ask is, I think is in my view anyway, as we go forward with this process and these conversations, we have to listen. As anyone in a position of, you know, a policymaker position, we need to listen to what the businesses are looking for and need, as well as the customers and Nevada residents. Because I think as Mr. Ross and Mr. Wellinghoff have emphasized, is if we build it right, you know, the businesses will come. And if we don't build it right, they won't. And to really do that right, I think we need to listen to what would be appealing and doable for companies such as yourself.
Well, just realizing that's what the cooperative model is. You know, it's listening. We're a grassroots organization. We're driven by our members to do what they want to do. And, you know, and this isn't a sales pitch, but it's, you know, our broadband to rural Nevada, it's our transmission sale, it's holding rates steady. It's talking to those guys and looking out for what is potentially the best for them and listening to them. And then making that action and moving quickly to make those things be accomplished. So when Ms. Carino said that about making sure we're flexible, you know, I think that's paramount to what we want to do in the future. As we make mistakes or changes need to be made, who's doing them, excuse me, when can we get them done, and how fast can we move to get them completed?
Because I think part of, you know, this initiative conversation is to remove some of the bureaucracy in the bureaucratic process, you know, from this paradigm, and allow some of the business opportunity to grow and to flourish, and to do that in a way that's not destructive and not reckless, but also is not smothering. And if we create this in a way that's smothering, and then the businesses aren't going to show up, and then it's not going to work, I think the way it's envisioned to work. And so I think the voices such as your company and others who may be listening are really vital to getting this right.
And remember, just as Hank said a second ago, we've been here for 50 years, we've been doing this, we've been serving the rurals, we've been listening to them. And we just look forward to seeing what we can do in the future to help all Nevada move forward in that market. Okay.
So I've noticed you've been here the past couple of days, so thank you for coming up and speaking. I appreciate it. Ms. Cuneo, go ahead, please.
So there were just a couple things that I wanted to mention. First of all, with respect to geography, you were concerned, had initial concern about rurals versus urban service, and I agree with Mr. Wellinghock and Mr. Ross that geography only matters with how you design your distribution rates. If you peanut butter distribution rates over all the state, then it doesn't matter where you're located.
Peanut butter?
Peanut butter. Spread.
Sorry. I like that.
It doesn't matter where you're located. If the customer's distribution rates in Elko are the same as the customer distribution rates in North Las Vegas. But that, of course, is a question and would be an issue anytime the distribution service provider, NV Energy, theoretically, comes in for a rate case. Because as you well know, costs of service differ in Elko than in North Las Vegas. So to a certain extent, you have some socialization or subsidization going on between higher cost points of service and lower cost points of service. And whether that's the state policy to do that is something that we'll have to consider both in the distribution rate and in the design of the system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then with respect to munis and co-ops being sort of the right of first refusal, my philosophy, staff's philosophy is more along the lines, if you want to be a competitor, you can compete. I think that's fine, that munis and co-ops can still continue to exist. And if they want to, if their customers have a meaningful choice, as is called out by the constitutional amendment, they're going to have to set up their own distribution rates so that customers could theoretically find an alternative provider. And I kind of wanted to ask Mr. Tomchuk or anyone else who'd like, is how might you envision that process working? You'd have to set up distribution rates for your muni and co-op services in order for a competitor to come in and be able to offer a service to your current member, if you don't mind.
No, if you'd like to answer that, go ahead.
In part, Chris Township for the record, we set rates today. It's generation, transmission, and distribution rates. So it's really just doing similar work that we're doing today. So it's making sure that those rates are fair and equitable, and they're well put out there for our members to take a look at and make comment on. So it's no different than PUC, and it's just our local boards do that, and we would desire that to continue to be the local boards who make those decisions in those kind of areas.
Thank you for responding to Ms. Cuneo's question. Hello, sir.
Good morning, or afternoon. I guess a very good day. So my name is Clay Fitch. I'm the CEO for Wellsboro Electric, and I thought I'd just kind of answer the question, but maybe also, offer maybe some more perspective. One of the things we're talking about is choice if somebody wants to leave or however it goes. What happens today is we have members that leave us all the time, even in our service territory right now. In our neck of the woods, it's not that uncommon for somebody to say, I don't want to be part of the co-op. I'm going to put a propane generator, a windmill up here, and a solar panel, and I'm disconnecting. And so how it really works at a co-op is they're not, even in choice, you're not going to be terminating your electricity. You're going to be terminating your membership in the co-op. So that's why you have to have the ability for co-op memberships to, so if somebody wants to leave for whatever reason, because they're already doing it now, and for whatever reason they might want to do it into the future, the boards have to have the ability to write the rules on this is how you would go about terminating your membership. And of course, if they wanted to get another energy provider, they'd go get one, then they'd terminate the membership in our organization. However, they're going to have to continue if they want to use our distribution system. The same as that we have standby rates now. Some of those people leave. Yeah, they really like the idea that they really want to be on their own, but they'd like us to kind of still stay interconnected here, so in case, the wind doesn't blow and something blows up or whatever happens, or they get sick and tired of trying to do it themselves, we have a rate for being in standby. I think our cooperatives would have no problem. Any of our members over there would say, when presented with whatever it has to be, our local boards would look at what needs to be done. We've designed distribution rates. Right now, we've been unbundling our rates for 20 years in order, because our members ask for it. We have large customers, and so I don't see that as a great big challenge that's out there. Remember, we don't mark up energy. We don't go buy it and mark it up. Energy is straight through a pass-through. So you can already see the rates are over here. Is the energy is the piece that wherever it comes from, there's no lost revenue. So it's just we generate most of our revenue off of our distribution system, and we offer that at cost.
Thank you, Mr. Fitch. Good afternoon, Mr. Sullivan.
Chairman, good afternoon. For the record, Dylan Sullivan from the Natural Resources Defense Council. I wanted to talk about the provider of last resort issues and just present a perspective that I don't think's been talked about yet today. We reference in our comments a paper back in 2000 that was written by Professor Joskow at MIT, and he's one of the most noted energy economists operating, and I think now he leads the Sloan Foundation. And it's titled, it has a provocative title, and I'm about to make a provocative point, so I'm kind of nervous, but it's titled, "Why Do We Need Electricity Retailers?" or "Can You Get It Cheaper Wholesale?" And basically in this article, and I don't agree with all the conclusions of it, but what the author does is sort of set up a thought experiment. So as part of this transition to retail competition, if the Energy Choice Initiative is approved again, we talked yesterday, you're going to have to set up a wholesale market and also a retail market. The kind of provocative question that Professor Joskow asks is, if customers conceptually, like he's doing a thought experiment here, but if customers can go and buy energy directly from the wholesale market, why do we need retailers, is his question. And for some very large customers, that actually is an option. They can work with a retailer who can basically just go directly to the wholesale market and provide them a rate that closely reflects that. The point that the professor tries to make is that there are a lot of costs in the electricity retailing business that need to be recovered in extra value provided to customers. So one of the retailers, or it might have been RISA in their initial comments, talked about the advertising necessary to establish a brand as being large enough that it's kind of a second economic stimulus for the state of Nevada. Over the long term, those are all, those advertising costs, those marketing costs, the cost to establish a brand, are costs that are going to have to be recovered from customers. And it really is important that retailers provide benefits and service kind of in excess of those extra costs, or else this whole exercise isn't really worthwhile. So what the professor ends up advocating for at the end is that the polar rate be set very closely to the wholesale market price of energy, and that there be a really close relationship between what's going on in the wholesale market and what's going on in the retail market. Because that is, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here.
Sorry, I'm following.
Yeah,
I'm following you in I think those are important questions. I mean, as we're looking at disruptive technology, as we're looking at disrupting and rethinking, reimagining the paradigm that we've had for the past 100 years. Those are important questions to ask, and I was alluding to that, I think, just a little bit, is in respect of, is a retail market a middleman? I asked something along those lines, and will 40, 50 years from now, again, when we have battery storage and electric vehicles and drones and who knows what, the concerns that we have today be very, very different or not as important.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't necessarily mean that the default rate for customers who don't make a choice should be the hourly price of electricity on the wholesale market. But I do think there are some approaches that, to me, don't sound like a great idea, and that is making the polar rate much higher than the rate that's charged by retailers, because that, I think that gives, I don't know how to say this any kinder, but that lets retailers off too easy. They need to be providing service in excess of what customers could just get in the on the wholesale market if they were large enough to actually be there.
I think you're raising an important point, because as we pull away, the commission right now, again, I have a general rate case, and I set those rates. And as if the commission loses the ability to no longer do that, that opens that up to different forces, and so the government will no longer be setting what those rates are. And why I do think this is really important with respect to the polar question is, right now, for example, I live in Reno, and I set a fixed, basic fixed service charge for customers in the Sierra Pacific territory. That territory covers a wide geographic area in northern Nevada, and whether NV Energy Sierra Pacific Power has to send a service truck to my house, from their headquarters, it might only be a few miles, but if they need to send it somewhere else, it could be hundreds of miles. Sure. And my still monthly basic service charge stays the same, because I'm able to spread those different costs around, and the commission's not going to be able to do that in that way anymore.
And I think it could be that the transmission cost spreading is the right policy decision to encourage retailers to serve the broad geographic area. But that itself is an important policy decision that I think merits attention, because there are different costs to serve customers in different parts of the state, and it's just an important decision to make. And
in right now, the philosophy is everyone's in there together, and we're all in it together. And a part of the re-regulation is it's separating some of that, and so there's a risk in rural areas. People will experience more direct costs of what it truly costs to get there, as opposed to having it spread and allocated over large groups of people. And will that cause rates to rise? That's kind of what I'm concerned with.
Sure, and I don't want to offer a specific opinion about transmission costs. I just, thanks for the opportunity to speak on this.
No, thanks. Mr. Ross.
Two very quick comments, because I know we're staring at lunch. At least I hope you are. First, on his point about advertising costs, or costs borne in the Joskow study, the study even existed before retail competition existed in Texas, so we don't have any model for that. I will point out that these are not ratepayers, these are customers. And to the extent we have to put advertising costs out, we wear those costs. We cannot pass those costs through. If I raise my rates, I lose customers, okay? It is a notable distinction here that we have to keep in the backs of our minds through this entire discussion. This is not a cost-based exercise. This is an exercise in driving the business to do the most efficient, smart, best thing they can do to win customers. It's just a different way of looking at the market. So I would say a lot of us have worn advertising costs that didn't bear fruit, and that's just the nature of the business. The second thing is, we have to keep in mind, and I encourage NV Energy to comment on this, regardless of what you do with this, you're going to have to make changes in how your utilities recoup their costs. Technology is forcing that change all across the world, and the old standard method of pushing costs out on a per kilowatt hour consumption basis is being questioned all over the country. And we are participating in proceedings about, is that going to be sustainable if people continue to go off grid and to build rooftop solar and to self-serve, as our friend in the co-ops mentioned, the rural co-ops earlier. as folks begin to do that, it changes the rate structure and the cost recoupment by the utility. So regardless of what you do in this proceeding, just bear in mind that it's going to change. The 100-year-old rate structure of cost of service rates it requires a relook of some kind. So just know that status quo isn't going to work.
Appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
And with that, we are going to take an hour lunch break and come back at 1:30. I do want to resume some more conversations about Polar, and then we'll open it up to an open comment period. Thank you. We'll resume to 1:30.